Okay, we're going to start out by discussing the history of high-speed rail in the United States and the lessons that we can learn from it. In my opinion, the true history of high-speed rail in the United States starts out with the story of the Office of High-Speed Ground Transportation and its partners, the New Haven Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the suppliers, United Aircraft and the Budd Company. And if we look at the way the intercity passenger rail looked in the northeastern portion of the United States back in the mid-60s, it was pretty sad. Basically, all the locomotives, tracks, and cars and electric systems hadn't been upgraded since the 1930s, and they really weren't being maintained well at all. And of course, the railroads were already losing a lot of business to airlines, but thanks to this neglect of their infrastructure and disinvestment in it, they were actually losing a lot more. Now, there were a few high points in passenger rail during this time period, and mainly it was from the commuter side. The Budd Company of Philadelphia, in cooperation with the state of Pennsylvania, was developing self-propelled multiple-unit commuter rail cars for use in Philadelphia area commuter service. These were called the Silverliners, but unfortunately none of this technology had made its way over to the through trains, to the long-distance intercity passenger trains. So we find Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island, who conveyed an important message about intercity rail in the Northeast. And he stated this vision in his book, Megalopolis Unbound. And in it, he stated that railroads were not obsolete, they just suffered from technological retardation, which seems like an inappropriate word to use today, but what he really meant to say is that they had disinvested in their technology, or they didn't have enough investment in technology to be competitive. He believed that the cities from Boston and Washington, D.C. along the northeast corner of the United States were both the knowledge and talent centers of the country, and that they had strong interrelations, which meant that there were a lot of people and knowledge that should be passing back and forth between them. So being as these cities were built sort of like European cities with strong, walkable, transit-friendly downtowns, he thought it would be a great idea if we connected them with high-speed rail, and that by doing this, these cities would be able to live up to their full economic potential. So, to fulfill this vision, in 1965, he sponsored the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act, which established the Office of High-Speed Ground Transportation and gave it funding to go out and do research and development into high-speed train sets. Now, there's one major difference between this U.S. approach to high-speed rail and European approach, and that's that the United States still expected the private passenger railroads to put up most of the money for upgrading their tracks and buying the equipment. In other words, over here the government was only supposed to be in the development and research role. So the first thing they did was they went out and borrowed some of these Silverliners, the high-speed commuter rail cars by Budd, and changed the gearing on them and got them running up to 156 miles an hour, as you can see here in these pictures. And this attracted a lot of attention, and things looked pretty good. So they wound up signing a contract with the Pennsylvania Railroad to provide high-speed service between New York and Washington, D.C. The Pennsylvania Railroad spent $44.5 million to buy new multiple-unit cars from the Budd Company, and these would eventually be called the Metroliners. And like today, they were trying to spur a homegrown or local supply industry. So they had both General Electric and Westinghouse supply the electrical components for these cars. And this is what the finished products look like. Not very pretty, but they did get the job done. They were fast, and they did have parlor and snack cars, but other than that, there weren't really any amenities. They were pretty cramped and dark and had really tiny windows, so you really couldn't enjoy your ride on them very much. But what they did do, and they did it quite well, is they went very fast, about 160 miles an hour. And even though they would be limited to 125 miles an hour in revenue service because the track at Canton area wasn't up to true high-speed train standards, they still were a pretty big success. They were able to cover the distance between New York City and Washington, D.C. in about 3 hours, which was 35 minutes faster than the previous train schedule. Because of this, their downtown to downtown travel times were about competitive with the airline shuttles, and they were able to capture about 50% of the travel market between New York City and Washington, D.C. And even more importantly, they were able to turn a profit and have been the only passenger trains in the U.S. to do so ever since. Of course, like with all passenger trains, eventually Amtrak wound up taking over the service. And just to study what the lessons are that we can learn from the Metroliner project, basically we learned that in order to have successful high-speed rail, you have to be able to connect thriving, walking and transit-friendly downtowns. Your cities have to have interrelated purposes, so there has to be like a latent demand for travel between them. The total downtown to downtown trip times have to be airline competitive, which doesn't mean that you need super fast trains, but what you do need is a train that gets from downtown to downtown in the same amount of time that it takes you to drive outside of the city to the airport, take a plane, and then take a taxi or a bus or something back to the downtown of the other city. And of course, being as the trains go directly downtown, it's much more convenient than taking the multimodal trip out to the airports and back. So being as the Metroliner was such a big success, why don't we just duplicate its success again? Well, we can't really do that because, first of all, there are not many cities outside of the Northeast that have strong transit-friendly downtowns. Secondly, there are no more private railroads that are in the passenger railroad business. And even the Pennsylvania Railroad only put up its own money because they wanted government approval of their merger with the New York Central Railroad. They really didn't care about high-speed rail at all. They just did it to get political favor. And the Northeast Corridor between New York City and Washington is a very exceptional railroad which had been heavily upgraded for high-speed rail during the 1930s. And there really is nothing else like it in the country. So they definitely had an advantage for this project. So as you might remember, Senator Claiborne Pell was actually from Rhode Island, so he was not going to leave Rhode Island out of the high-speed rail loop. He insisted that there be high-speed rail service between New York City and Boston that would stop at Providence, Rhode Island. So unfortunately, this portion of the project was going to be a lot more complicated because it would mean running trains over the New Haven Railroad, which was bankrupt, and the railroad between New Haven and Boston was not electrified, and it was a fairly curvy, slow, and not upgraded railroad. So the Office of High-Speed Ground Transportation set out to purchase some specialized train sets. And fortunately, United Aircraft was working on exactly the right train set at this point in time. They've been working with an American innovator, or railroad innovator, named Alan Cripp. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, but he had a long history of developing high-speed rail, or faster trains for the United States, and it actually had one running between New York City and Boston for a while, but it inevitably failed because the New Haven Railroad's mechanical forces couldn't maintain its exotic German diesel hydraulic drive system. But he was still firmly convinced that high-tech was the way to go if you had the right or properly maintained mechanical forces involved. So he got together with United Aircraft and designed something called a turbo train. And this train was very unique because it had a pendular suspension, or in other words, a hanging suspension, which in effect allowed the train to bank into the curve, so it didn't have to slow down as much on curvy portions of the railroad. It also featured an extremely exotic engine and drive system. It was powered by 6 airplane-style gas turbine engines, which were very lightweight but also provided very high horsepower. And Alan had been in the railroad business since the era of the streamliner, so he was a firm believer in giving people amenities. So we actually added dome cars onto his trains, like some of the trains it had out west, so that you could get a full 360-degree view, front, behind, and above you while you were traveling along the scenic Connecticut coast. And you can see a dome car right here, which those are very popular for people to ride in. So a contract was signed, and it was decided that the New Haven Railroad would operate the trains, and United Aircraft would maintain them because they were really afraid that the New Haven Railroad would in effect break or mess up the trains if they maintained them themselves. So this project was a pretty big success. The trains actually were able to achieve a land speed railroad record of over 170 miles an hour, and it was decided that the project would be extended to have the trains run all the way from New York City to Boston. After the Penn Central Railroad merger happened, the trains finally began running, and they were really limited to 110 miles an hour because the track was so bad. But they were still able to cut a significant amount of time off the running schedule, and the Department of Transportation, in their opinion, but not official studies, believed that they had airline people riding the trains. Like, they didn't actually interview people, they just got on the train and said, oh, these look like airline people, so this project must be successful. But whatever it was, Amtrak eventually took over the passenger service like they did all other passenger service in the US, and they actually started buying more turbo train sets and expanding the number of cars run on the original train sets. But then the Arab oil embargo hit, and the trains were found to be very fuel inefficient, so they were taken out of service in '76 and scrapped. So ultimately, their exotic engines wound up being their doom, like the exotic train sets before then. So a few lessons we can take away from this short-lived but fairly successful project. Number one is that in order to lower your running times between two pairs of cities, you don't necessarily need to go really fast. If you have a train that can run faster on curvy track like the turbo train, or also be able to switch over to electric power so it can run directly into cities without having to hook up a diesel engine to it, you can cut a lot of running time out of your schedule without actually running at very high speeds. We can also take away from this project that maybe amenities like dome cars and things like that might be able to entice people into riding the train because they'll probably figure that's a special form of transportation. Also, very importantly, we can learn that it's very risky to experiment with exotic types of engines in your trains. In this case, it didn't really work out, so maybe we're better off just biting the bullet and paying the money to electrify our railroads, which eventually is what happened to the railroad between New York City and Boston, which is how Amtrak is able to run the Accelas today on all electric. So that's about it.